So we move to facilitated diffusion. In this case, we basically know that you need a carrier protein. You need a molecule that will be able to carry these molecules or compounds from one part of this, from one side of the cell membrane to the other side of the cell membrane. And we already said it is a passive process, and it is faster than simple diffusion. So we look at this scenario. You have a diabetic patient who is being monitored for glucose uptake into the cells. Medical staff explain that even though glucose is small, it requires a specific carrier protein to enter the cells. Okay, and that therefore means that glucose is transported into cells through facilitated diffusion because of this carrier protein. We already said that you cannot have carrier proteins in simple diffusion, and therefore facilitated diffusion is actually much more faster than simple diffusion. Okay, so why is glucose used in facilitated diffusion to enter cells while oxygen uses simple diffusion? That's a question that we have there. And then another question is describe one similarity and difference between facilitated diffusion and active transport, and then predict what could happen if the carrier protein for glucose actually malfunctions. Okay, I think we can start with that last question. When you don't have these carrier proteins, it means that some of these molecules will not be transported efficiently. So in this case, there will be a problem with the absorption of glucose into cells. And remember that glucose can still diffuse, okay, from the GIT or from the small intestines, especially into the bloodstreams. And then when the glucose is in the bloodstream, it has to be taken up by the cell such that you have a normal blood glucose levels. And therefore, if we cannot take this glucose into the cells, then it means that you're going to have high glucose levels in blood, and that is an issue to do with diabetes mellitus. Okay, so you have increased blood glucose in your blood. And then one similarity and difference between facilitated diffusion and active transport. One similarity is, of course, they involve movement of molecules or even ions across the cell membrane. Okay, the difference is that one is an active process, that is active transport uses energy, and then for facilitated diffusion you don't have energy being utilized. And then the other point is about explaining why glucose uses facilitated diffusion to enter into the cells while oxygen uses simple diffusion. It's basically because you have glucose transporters in cell membranes of certain cells, but oxygen, we don't have special transporters or special oxygen carrier molecules such that they can use facilitated diffusion. So oxygen basically just enters the cells through simple diffusion because of lack of those carrier proteins for oxygen. So we have already defined that the key thing is that there should be carrier proteins, and this usually traverse the whole cell membrane. Okay, so they aid in movement of these organic compounds like glucose and even sometimes minerals. It is much faster than diffusion, and that's why you see that the blue curve it's actually higher compared to the passive diffusion that you have in there. The key thing is that you can categorize these special carriers or special protein carriers into two: carrier proteins and then channel proteins. The key thing is that both of these are actually proteins. And if you can look at this image here, we are having carrier protein there. Okay, so the carrier protein usually can undergo a conformational change. So the molecule attaches on one side and then it is released on the other side. And then for channels, you're basically having parts for these either minerals or even organic compounds to take. Okay, so glucose needs carrier proteins, and we are saying that if glucose does not have carrier proteins, it will not go into the cells where we need to store it. Okay, so the glucose needs to be taken into the muscles, need to be taken into fat cells or adipocytes. It also needs to be absorbed from the intestines into the bloodstream, and the same thing also happens in the kidney tubules. Okay, so usually this is down the concentration gradient, and like we say, it is aided by conformational change. The protein carrier or the carrier protein basically changes its structure. That's what we term as the conformational change. Okay, when we have channels, when we talk about channel proteins, we are talking about holes through which these materials can basically pass. Okay, so these channels can be ligand-gated. Okay, that means that for them they open when you have a particular molecule that binds to them, and then they can open. And then others can only open when there is an impulse, where you have a change in membrane potential. And therefore, these channels basically are very important for ion movement: chloride, potassium, calcium, chloride, and hydrogen carbonate ions. In plants, for example, we have special carrier proteins that we call aquaporins. So the aquaporins are found in plants, but also some animal cells also have them. So they basically make the process of transport very fast. They increase the process of transport very fast. They increase the process of transport. Okay, so they increase the rate of osmosis down the water potential gradient. Okay, so across some plant and animal cells, you can have what we call the aquaporins that increase the rate of transport of these molecules. Okay, simple diffusion, you don't need a carrier protein. It's facilitated, you definitely need. Facilitated diffusion usually follows one direction, but for simple diffusion, because of the concentration gradient, you have movement happening, and mainly the particles moving from where they are highly concentrated to where they are low concentration. But of course, that does not mean that you cannot have some particles moving in the opposite direction. But of course, what we shall see is that they're moving to the area of low concentration. So facilitated diffusion is faster, and we have explained that. Okay, so both processes involve transport of materials. Okay, so they move from high to low, and that's what, therefore, you don't have energy being required, and happens across a semi-permeable membrane or a partially permeable or membrane. So no ATP is required.